the monster's origin story. Every villain has an origin story. The Joker was failed by society and driven mad by cruelty. Magneto survived the Holocaust and learned that humans would always persecute those who are different. Darth Vader lost everything he loved and chose power over grief. These are fictional tales, but they reflect a psychological truth. Villains are not born but made, not hatched from eggs, fully formed in their malevolence, but shaped through experience, through wounds, through choices made in response to suffering that seemed unbearable. We want to believe that evil people are fundamentally different from us, that they were always monstrous, that something is missing or broken in them that makes their cruelty inevitable. This belief protects us from the uncomfortable truth. The capacity for villainy lives in everyone, and the difference between hero and villain is often not moral superiority but circumstance, not inherent goodness but how we respond to the wounds that life inflicts, not nature but the complex interaction of trauma, choice, and the stories we tell ourselves to justify what we become. The transformation from ordinary person to villain follows patterns, has stages, involves psychological mechanisms that can be identified and understood. It begins with wounds, with experiences of injustice or betrayal or abandonment that create deep pain. It continues through resentment, through the nursing of grievances, through the construction of narratives that justify revenge. It accelerates through moral disengagement, through the dehumanization of victims, through the gradual erosion of empathy and conscience. And it culminates in identification with villainy itself, in becoming the monster, in making evil not just something one does, but something one is. Understanding why people become villains is not about excusing their actions, but about recognizing the psychological processes that transform ordinary humans into perpetrators of extraordinary harm. This is the origin story not of fictional characters but of real human darkness. The nature of villainy, more than evil. Villainy is not the same as evil, though the two are often confused. Evil, in its purest form, is the capacity to harm without reason, to destroy for destruction's sake, to inflict suffering because suffering itself provides satisfaction. But villains, the ones we encounter in reality rather than in simplistic moral tales, are rarely evil in this pure sense. They are people who have convinced themselves that their harmful actions are justified, who have constructed elaborate narratives that frame their cruelty as response to cruelty, their violence as defense against violence, their destruction as necessary for some greater good. The villain sees themselves as hero of their own story. This is crucial to understanding how villainy operates psychologically. The Nazi bureaucrat does not experience himself as perpetrating genocide, but as serving his nation, protecting his people, following orders in a time of war. The abusive parent does not see themselves as tormenting their child, but as providing necessary discipline, teaching important lessons, preparing the child for a harsh world. The corporate executive who destroys communities for profit does not experience themselves as villain, but as successful businessman, as someone who understands how the world really works, as pragmatist rather than idealist. This self-justification is not simply dishonesty or conscious manipulation, though it can include both. It involves genuine psychological processes that allow people to harm others while maintaining positive self-image, to commit acts they would condemn in others while experiencing themselves as justified, even noble. Psychologist Albert Bandura identified these mechanisms of moral disengagement, moral justification, where harm is reframed as serving higher purpose, euphemistic labeling, where cruel acts are given sanitized names, displacement of responsibility, where the person claims they are just following orders or had no choice, dehumanization, where victims are seen as less than human and therefore less deserving of moral consideration. These mechanisms do not simply excuse villainy after the fact. They enable it in the first place, create the psychological conditions under which ordinary people can commit extraordinary harm without experiencing the guilt and shame that would otherwise prevent such behavior. When we can convince ourselves that what we are doing is not really harmful, or that the harm is justified, or that we are not responsible, or that the victims are not fully human, then the normal barriers against cruelty fall away. But villainy also has an archetypal dimension that goes beyond individual psychology. Carl Jung understood the villain, the adversary, the dark figure, as an archetype, living in the collective unconscious, representing the shadow not just of individuals, but of cultures, of humanity itself. Every hero story requires a villain, because the villain represents what the hero must overcome, what consciousness must confront, what must be defeated or integrated for development to occur. In mythology and literature, villains often embody qualities that the hero and the culture have rejected. They are chaotic where order is valued, selfish where sacrifice is demanded, truthful about dark realities where comfortable lies are preferred. The villain often speaks truths that no one wants to hear, reveals hypocrisies that everyone wants to ignore, acts on desires that everyone feels but suppresses. This is why villains are often more interesting than heroes, why audiences are drawn to them, why we recognize something of ourselves in their rebellion against constraints we also chafe under. The archetype of the villain also represents the danger of one-sided development, of identifying so completely with one pole of existence that the opposite pole is completely denied. The villain who pursues power at the expense of all else, who values strength and despises weakness, who sees compassion as pathetic and cruelty as strength. This villain represents what happens when certain values are taken to their extreme while their necessary opposites are completely rejected. But real villains, the ones we encounter in life rather than in stories, are more complex than archetypes. They are people with histories, with wounds, with their own internal logic, however twisted it may appear from outside. Understanding this complexity does not mean condoning their actions, but means recognizing that villainy is comprehensible, follows patterns, emerges from identifiable psychological and social processes, rather than from some mysterious evil essence. The journey to villainy often begins with legitimate grievance. The person experiences real injustice, real betrayal, real harm. They are abused as children, are victims of systemic oppression, experience traumatic loss, are genuinely wronged by others. This initial victimization is real, and the pain and anger that arise from it are justified. The person has every right to feel outraged, to demand justice, to want those who harmed them to be held accountable. But somewhere in the process of responding to this legitimate grievance, something shifts. The pursuit of justice becomes pursuit of revenge. The anger that was proportionate to the harm becomes hatred that exceeds it. The desire for accountability becomes desire to inflict suffering. The person crosses from victim seeking redress to perpetrator inflicting harm, often without recognizing the crossing, often while still experiencing themselves as victim, as someone whose actions are justified by what was done to them. This transformation is facilitated by what Nietzsche called ressentiment, a poisonous mixture of resentment, envy, and moral judgment that turns the weak into secret enemies of the strong, that transforms inability to act into claim of moral superiority, that makes a virtue of powerlessness while seething with desire for revenge. Resentment is not simple anger or justified outrage. It is anger that is fermented, that has been nursed and cultivated, that has become central to identity, that has transformed from response to circumstances into fundamental orientation toward the world. The person consumed by resentment cannot let go of their grievances because the grievances have become who they are. Their identity is built around having been wronged, around being victim, around the moral superiority that victimhood confers. They do not want justice in the sense of fair resolution. They want revenge. They want those who harmed them to suffer as they suffered, want to reverse the power dynamic and inflict on others what was inflicted on them. This is the psychological soul in which villainy grows. The person begins as legitimate victim but becomes victimizer, begins with justified grievance but ends with disproportionate cruelty, begins seeking justice but ends perpetrating injustice. And throughout this transformation, they maintain the narrative of victimhood, continue to experience themselves as responding to harm rather than initiating it, continue to frame their cruelty as justified by what was done to them. The villain is therefore not the opposite of the victim, but is often the victim who has chosen a particular response to victimization, who has allowed legitimate pain to curdle into destructive hatred, who has made revenge rather than healing the organizing principle of their existence. This does not mean all victims become villains. Most do not. Most find ways to heal, to move forward, to respond to their wounds without perpetuating cycles of harm. But some, for reasons that involve both choice and circumstance, both psychology and opportunity, transform their victimization into justification for victimizing others. Understanding the nature of villainy therefore requires recognizing it as process rather than as state, as something people become rather than something they are, as the endpoint of a journey that begins with legitimate suffering and ends with a choice to inflict suffering on others. The villain is not born a villain, but is made through experiences that wound, through resentments that fester, through choices to respond to harm by perpetuating it, through the construction of narratives that justify cruelty as response to cruelty. This understanding is uncomfortable because it reveals that villainy is comprehensible, is rooted in experiences and emotions we can recognize in ourselves, follows psychological processes that are not alien but human. The capacity to become a villain lives in everyone who has been wounded, everyone who has felt the desire for revenge, everyone who has experienced the satisfaction of imagining harm coming to those who harm them. The difference between those who become villains and those who do not is not the presence or absence of these feelings, but how we respond to them, whether we act on them or integrate them, whether we let them define us or choose to move beyond them. The wounded child, trauma and the birth of the villain. Nearly every villain's story, when traced back to its origins, reveals a wounded child. Not all wounded children become villains, but the seeds of villainy are almost always planted in childhood, in experiences of abuse or neglect or betrayal that create psychic wounds so deep that they shape everything that follows, that create patterns of relating to the world, that can, under certain conditions, transform into villainy. The child who is beaten learns that violence is how power operates, that the strong dominate the weak, that the world is organized according to who can inflict pain and who must endure it. The child who is neglected learns that their needs do not matter, that others cannot be trusted to care, that survival requires not depending on anyone, not allowing oneself to be vulnerable. The child who is betrayed by those who should protect them learns that trust is dangerous, that people who claim to love you will hurt you, that the world is fundamentally hostile and one must always be defended against it. These lessons, learned in childhood when the psyche is most vulnerable and most malleable, become foundational beliefs about reality, about human nature, about how the world works. They are not consciously chosen beliefs but implicit assumptions carved into the nervous system through repeated experience, written into the architecture of the developing brain through trauma that occurs before the child has capacity to process or make sense of what is happening to them. Developmental trauma, as psychologist Judith Herman describes it, occurs when the harm is inflicted by caregivers during critical periods of development, when the child is dependent on the very people who are hurting them, when there is no escape and no one to turn to for protection. This creates a particular kind of psychological damage, more profound and more lasting than trauma that occurs in adulthood, because it shapes the formation of self, disrupts the development of secure attachment, prevents the child from learning that the world can be safe or that people can be trusted. The child experiencing developmental trauma cannot simply leave the abusive situation or fight back against the perpetrator. They must find ways to survive psychologically while remaining in circumstances that are overwhelming their capacity to cope. The strategies they develop, the defenses they construct, the ways they organize their psyche to manage unbearable reality, these become the templates for how they will relate to the world throughout life, unless significant healing occurs. One common response is identification with the aggressor. The child cannot defeat the abusive parent, cannot escape, cannot make the abuse stop, so they identify with the aggressor instead, internalize the aggressor's perspective, begin to see themselves as the aggressor sees them, as deserving of the abuse, as fundamentally bad or wrong. But they also internalize the aggressor's power, begin to fantasize about having that power themselves, begin to imagine a future where they are no longer the victim but the victimizer, where they inflict rather than endure. This identification is not conscious choice but automatic psychological defense, a way of maintaining some sense of control in a situation where they are actually powerless, a way of managing the terror of helplessness by imagining oneself as powerful. The child tells themselves, "When I grow up, I will never be weak like this again. I will be strong. I will be the one others fear. No one will ever hurt me again because I will hurt them first." This fantasy of future power, this identification with the aggressor, can become the foundation for later villainy. The child grows up carrying both the wound of having been victimized and the internalized model of the victimizer, both the memory of helplessness and the determination to never be helpless again, both the experience of being harmed and the template for harming others. Whether this potential for villainy is actualized depends on many factors: later experiences, relationships that might provide healing, opportunities to process trauma, the presence or absence of other models for how to be in the world. But the wounded child carries within them the seeds of the villain they might become. They carry rage at having been hurt, at having been helpless, at the injustice of what was done to them. They carry distrust of others, inability to be vulnerable, hypervigilance for threat, expectation of betrayal. They carry the belief that the world is fundamentally hostile, that people are fundamentally cruel, that power is the only thing that matters, because only power can protect against being victimized again. Attachment trauma is particularly relevant to understanding villainy. The child who experiences secure attachment, who has caregivers who are consistently responsive and attuned, develops the capacity for empathy, for recognizing others as separate beings with their own feelings and needs, for feeling connected to others rather than fundamentally separate and alone. But the child who experiences severe attachment disruption, whose caregivers are abusive or neglectful or inconsistent, does not develop this capacity in the same way. Research on attachment shows that children with disorganized attachment, the pattern that emerges from frightening or traumatic interactions with caregivers, often show reduced empathy, increased aggression, difficulty regulating emotions, and problems with conscience development. These are not fixed traits, but patterns that emerge from early relational trauma, patterns that create vulnerability for later antisocial behavior, for the kind of empathy deficits and moral disengagement that characterize villainy. The child who does not experience empathic attunement from caregivers struggles to develop empathy for others. Empathy is not simply innate capacity, but is learned through experience of being empathized with, through having one's own emotions recognized and validated, through seeing oneself reflected in the caring responses of others. Without this experience, the child may develop only rudimentary empathy, may understand intellectually that others have feelings, but not feel those feelings viscerally, not be moved by others' suffering in ways that would prevent them from inflicting it. This empathy deficit is not the same as psychopathy, though severe attachment trauma can contribute to development of psychopathic traits. Most people who become villains are not psychopaths, do not have the complete absence of empathy and conscience that characterizes psychopathy, but they often have impaired empathy, particularly for those they see as enemies or as belonging to outgroups, particularly when their own interests conflict with others' welfare, particularly when they have dehumanized their victims through the mechanisms of moral disengagement. The wounded child also develops what object relations theorists call internal working models, mental representations of self and others, and relationships that are formed through early experiences and that shape expectations and behaviors throughout life. The child who is abused develops an internal working model where relationships are dangerous, where closeness leads to harm, where others cannot be trusted, where one must always be defended and vigilant. These internal working models operate largely outside conscious awareness, but powerfully shape how the person relates to others, how they interpret others' behaviors, how they respond to situations. The person with a model that says others are fundamentally hostile and threatening will perceive hostility and threat even when none exists, will respond defensively or aggressively to neutral behaviors, will create through their own actions the very rejection and hostility they expect, confirming the model and making it more rigid. This creates self-fulfilling prophecies where the person's expectations based on early trauma create conditions that confirm those expectations. The person who expects betrayal behaves in ways that elicit betrayal. The person who expects rejection acts in ways that lead to rejection. The person who expects hostility responds with preemptive hostility that generates genuine hostility in others. And each confirmation strengthens the belief that the world is, as the early trauma taught them it was, that people cannot be trusted, that only power and control can protect against being hurt. The wounded child within the adult villain is still operating according to these early models, still responding to present situations as if they were the original trauma, still fighting battles that belong to the past, still trying to master through repetition what could not be mastered in childhood. The abusive parent is often reenacting their own abuse, doing to their child what was done to them, trying through this repetition to gain the power they lacked as children, to become the aggressor rather than the victim. The person who becomes a villain is often someone who never healed from childhood wounds, who never processed the trauma, who never developed different models of how relationships work or who people are. They remain psychologically frozen at the age they were wounded, responding to adult situations with the defenses and strategies of the wounded child, trying to protect themselves from dangers that may no longer be present, fighting enemies who may not be the enemies they think they are. This does not excuse villainy. Adults are responsible for their actions regardless of what happened to them as children, but it explains the origins, reveals the psychological processes through which childhood trauma can contribute to adult villainy, shows how the wounded child can become the villainous adult if healing does not occur, if the wounds are not processed, if different possibilities are not encountered. The tragedy is that villainy often perpetuates the very cycles it emerged from. The person who was abused becomes abusive. The person who was betrayed becomes betrayer. The person who was victimized becomes victimizer. The wound is passed down, is inflicted on the next generation, creates new wounded children who may themselves become villains unless the cycle is broken, through conscious intervention, through healing, through the choice to respond to one's own wounds differently than by inflicting them on others. Understanding that villains often originate as wounded children does not make them less dangerous, does not mean their actions should not be stopped or that they should not be held accountable. But it does reveal that villainy is not mysterious evil descending from nowhere, but is comprehensible human process, rooted in trauma, shaped by experience, following patterns that can be identified and potentially interrupted if we understand them clearly enough. Resentment and revenge, Nietzsche's warning. Friedrich Nietzsche understood something that most people refuse to face. Resentment is not simply an emotion, but a psychological poison that transforms victims into villains, that turns justified anger into destructive hatred, that makes revenge rather than healing the organizing principle of existence. He called this ressentiment, using the French word to distinguish it from ordinary resentment, to capture something more toxic, more consuming, more identity-defining than simple anger at injustice. Resentment, in Nietzsche's analysis, is what happens when people who have been genuinely harmed, who have legitimate grievances, who have experienced real injustice, cannot act directly to remedy their situation, and instead nurse their wounds, cultivate their hatred, make their victimhood central to their identity. It is the resentment of the powerless toward the powerful, the hatred of those who cannot strike back toward those who harm them, the slow-burning rage that festers in the absence of the capacity for direct action. Nietzsche traced resentment to what he called slave morality, the moral system created by the weak to make a virtue of their weakness, to reframe their inability to act as moral superiority, to condemn the qualities they lack, strength, power, assertiveness, as evil while elevating the qualities forced upon them by circumstance, meekness, humility, self-denial, as good. This is not conscious hypocrisy, but genuine psychological transformation, the alchemy through which powerlessness becomes purity, through which inability to act becomes moral choice, not to act. But beneath this moral transformation, Nietzsche saw something darker, the desire for revenge that cannot be directly expressed, and so takes the form of moral condemnation, of judging those who have power as evil, of imagining divine punishment awaiting them, of constructing elaborate systems that promise eventual reversal where the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Resentment does not seek actual justice, but seeks the satisfaction of seeing those who harm them suffer, prefers their enemies' downfall to one's own elevation, finds more pleasure in others' pain than in one's own happiness. This is the psychology of the villain emerging from legitimate victimization. The person begins with real grievance, with genuine harm inflicted upon them, with justified anger at injustice, but rather than processing this anger, rather than seeking actual remedies, rather than healing and moving forward, they nurse the wound, return to it obsessively, make it the center of their identity, define themselves through what was done to them rather than through who they might become despite it. This nursing of grievance serves several psychological functions. It provides identity, a clear sense of who one is, victim of specific wrongs, which can feel more substantial than the uncertain identity that comes from defining oneself through positive qualities or future possibilities. It provides moral superiority, the sense of being right, being justified, being on the side of justice against those who wrong them. It provides purpose, the mission of seeking revenge, or at least of ensuring that those who harmed them are recognized as wrong, as evil, as deserving of punishment. But most importantly, resentment provides the psychological justification for actions that would otherwise be recognized as wrong. Once the person has fully embraced their identity as victim, once they have made the harm done to them the central fact of their existence, once they have constructed a narrative where they are purely wronged and others are purely wrong, then anything they do in response seems justified. Revenge is not revenge, but justice. Cruelty is not cruelty, but proportionate response. Harm inflicted on those associated with those who harmed them is not innocent suffering, but deserved consequences. This is how victims become villains, while never recognizing the transformation, while continuing to experience themselves as victims even as they victimize others, while maintaining the moral high ground even as they perpetrate acts they would condemn if others committed them. The logic is simple. They harmed me, therefore I am justified in harming them, and anyone who interferes with my justified revenge becomes complicit with those who harmed me, and therefore becomes legitimate target as well. Nietzsche saw this dynamic operating at both individual and collective levels. Individually, the person consumed by resentment becomes incapable of genuine happiness because their satisfaction depends not on their own flourishing, but on their enemies' suffering, not on building a good life, but on seeing those who harmed them punished. They cannot heal, because healing would mean letting go of the identity as victim, would mean forgiving, or at least moving past the harm, would mean giving up the moral superiority and the justification for revenge that their victimhood provides. Collectively, resentment becomes the basis for entire moral and political systems. Nietzsche saw Christianity as fundamentally a religion of resentment, created by the powerless to condemn the powerful, making virtues of suffering and weakness while framing strength and power as sins. He saw socialist movements as expressions of resentment, the poor condemning the rich not simply for injustice but for having what they lack, wanting not equality but reversal, not fair distribution but punishment of those who have more. Whether or not one accepts Nietzsche's specific judgments about Christianity or socialism, the psychological insight remains valid. movements and ideologies can be driven by resentment, can be motivated less by desire for justice than by desire for revenge, can be more about punishing those seen as oppressors than about actually helping those seen as oppressed. And when this happens, when resentment rather than genuine pursuit of justice becomes the driving force, the results are often as harmful as what they claim to oppose. The person or group consumed by resentment cannot be satisfied by actual justice because justice would require letting go of the grievance, moving forward, accepting resolution. But the person whose identity is built around victimhood cannot accept resolution without losing themselves, without giving up the narrative that organizes their experience and justifies their actions. They need enemies, need ongoing oppression, need continued wrongs to maintain the structure of meaning they have built around being wronged. This is why some victims resist healing, resist moving past trauma, resist accepting that those who harmed them might be more complex than purely evil. Resist forgiveness not because forgiveness is inappropriate, but because forgiveness would mean giving up the identity of victim, and with it, the moral certainty and the justification for revenge that victimhood provides. They are psychologically invested in continuing to suffer, in maintaining their wounds, in seeing themselves as permanently damaged by what was done to them, because this permanent damage justifies permanent resentment and permanent pursuit of revenge. Nietzsche's warning is that resentment is self-destructive, that it poisons the person who harbors it more than it harms those it is directed against, that the desire for revenge consumes the one who desires it, that making one's identity about what was done to you prevents you from becoming who you might be despite it. The person consumed by resentment lives in the past, is controlled by those who harmed them even years or decades after the harm occurred, has given their enemies power over their present and future by refusing to move beyond what happened. But the warning goes deeper. Resentment does not simply prevent healing. It transforms victims into perpetrators, creates the psychological conditions under which those who were harmed become those who harm, turns legitimate grievance into justification for illegitimate cruelty. The cycle of violence, of revenge begetting revenge, of harm repaid with harm that exceeds the original and generates new desire for revenge. This cycle is driven by resentment, by the refusal to break the chain, by the insistence that one's own revenge is justified, while others' revenge against oneself is pure evil. Every villain consumed by desire for revenge believes their revenge is different, is justified, is response to wrongs, while others' actions against them were unprovoked evil. But this asymmetry is psychological rather than real. The person they are seeking revenge against often has their own grievances, their own narrative of victimization, their own resentment-fueled justifications. Each side sees themselves as victim responding to aggression rather than as aggressor initiating harm. Each side's revenge creates new grievances that fuel the next cycle. Breaking this cycle requires what Nietzsche saw as rare courage. The courage to let go of resentment, to refuse revenge, to heal rather than to harm, to build one's identity on who one is becoming rather than on what was done to one in the past. This is not weakness but strength, not passive acceptance of injustice but active choice to not perpetuate it, not forgetting but choosing not to be defined by what one cannot forget. The person who can do this, who can experience genuine harm and genuine injustice without allowing it to curdle into resentment, who can seek actual justice without needing revenge, who can heal without needing those who harmed them to suffer. This person has achieved something that Nietzsche saw as rare and noble: the ability to move beyond the victim-victimizer dynamic, to refuse to become villain even when one has every experiential justification for doing so. But most people, Nietzsche recognized, cannot do this. Most who are deeply harmed nurse the wound, cultivate the resentment, make revenge their purpose, become consumed by hatred that destroys them even as they believe it is destroying their enemies. This is the path from victim to villain, paved with resentment, maintained by the psychological need to justify one's hatred, culminating in actions that perpetuate the very cycles of harm that created the original victim. Nietzsche's warning remains urgent. Resentment is poison. It does not harm those it is directed against nearly as much as it harms the one who harbors it. It transforms legitimate victims into illegitimate perpetrators. It makes villainy seem like justice, revenge seem like righteousness, cruelty seem like appropriate response. And it creates cycles that perpetuate across generations, creating new victims who develop their own resentment and become new villains, endlessly repeating the pattern unless someone has the courage to break it. The Descent: How Good People Turn Bad. The transformation from ordinary person to villain is rarely sudden. It does not happen in a single moment of choice where someone decides to become evil. Instead, it happens gradually, through small steps that each seem justifiable in the moment, through compromises that accumulate, through boundaries that shift incrementally until the person has traveled a distance they never intended to go, has become someone they never imagined they would be. Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist who conducted the Stanford prison experiment, understands this better than almost anyone. In his experiment, ordinary college students were randomly assigned to play guards or prisoners in a simulated prison. Within days, the guards began acting with genuine cruelty, subjecting prisoners to psychological torture, abuse, humiliation. These were not bad people. They were normal students from good families, psychologically healthy, with no history of violence or sadism, but the situation transformed them. The transformation happened through gradual escalation. The first acts of cruelty were minor, making prisoners do push-ups, enforcing arbitrary rules. But each small act of cruelty made the next one easier, desensitized the guards to the prisoners' suffering, established patterns that normalized what should have remained shocking. By the end, guards were engaging in behaviors they would have found unthinkable at the beginning, behaviors they themselves would have condemned just days earlier. This is the slippery slope of moral descent. Each step seems small, seems justified by what came before, seems like a natural progression rather than a radical departure. The person does not wake up one day deciding to become a torturer. They start by enforcing discipline. They escalate to punishment for infractions. They increase the severity of punishments. They begin to enjoy the power. They dehumanize those they are punishing. And gradually, without any single moment of transformation, they have become someone who inflicts suffering, who has crossed lines they once considered absolute. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments revealed similar dynamics. Ordinary people, told by an authority figure to administer what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person, continued to do so even when the person screamed in pain, even when they pleaded to be released, even when they fell silent, suggesting they might be unconscious or dead. 65% of participants administered what they believed were potentially lethal shocks, not because they were sadists, but because they had agreed to participate, because the authority figure kept telling them to continue, because each shock was only slightly more severe than the previous one. The experiment revealed that situational factors, the presence of authority, the gradual escalation, the diffusion of responsibility, can override individual conscience and moral judgment. The participants were not evil people. Many showed signs of distress, questioned whether they should continue, expressed concern for the person receiving shocks. But they continued anyway, following orders, escalating incrementally, crossing boundaries they would have said were uncrossable. This is how ordinary people commit atrocities, not through sudden conversion to evil, but through gradual descent, through small compromises that accumulate, through situations that make each step seem necessary or justified or unavoidable. The Nazi who participates in genocide did not begin there. He began by accepting rhetoric about certain groups being problems. He progressed to tolerating discrimination. He escalated to participating in deportations. Each step made the next step easier, more normalized, more consistent with who he had already become. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil captures this perfectly. Studying Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat responsible for organizing the logistics of the Holocaust, she expected to find a monster and found instead a mediocre man. someone who was not driven by hatred or sadism but by desire to advance his career, to follow orders, to be efficient and competent at his assigned tasks. He did not see himself as perpetrating genocide, but as solving logistical problems, as doing his job, as following the law and serving his country. This banality is more terrifying than demonic evil, because it means that the capacity for atrocity does not require exceptional malice, but only ordinary obedience, ordinary careerism, ordinary failure to think critically about what one is doing and whether it is right. The person becomes a cog in a machine of destruction without ever making a conscious decision to do evil, without ever recognizing themselves as villain, without ever questioning whether the orders they are following should be followed. Dehumanization is crucial to this descent. It is extremely difficult to harm people you recognize as fully human, as beings like yourself with feelings and families and hopes and fears. But when people are successfully dehumanized, when they are seen as less than human, as vermin or animals or objects, then normal empathy and moral consideration do not apply. The Nazi could participate in killing Jews because Jews had been successfully dehumanized through years of propaganda, because they were seen not as people, but as parasites, as threats, as problems to be eliminated. This dehumanization happens through language, through the terms used to describe the targeted group. They are not people but illegals, not human beings but terrorists, not individuals but an infestation. The language creates psychological distance, makes it easier to think about them as category rather than as persons, allows moral disengagement that would be impossible if their full humanity were recognized. Group dynamics accelerate moral dissent. When everyone around you is participating in harmful behavior, when the group normalizes cruelty, when dissent is punished and conformity is rewarded, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to maintain individual moral standards. The person looks around, sees that others are doing it, concludes that it must be acceptable, fears being ostracized or punished if they refuse to participate. Conformity, pressure, groupthink, diffusion of responsibility through the collective, all these make it easier to participate in harm than to resist. The person who descends into villainy often experiences each step as necessary, as having no real choice, as doing what anyone would do in the same circumstances. I had to follow orders. I had no choice. Everyone was doing it. If I refused, they would have just found someone else to do it. These justifications are not simply post hoc rationalizations, but genuine experiences, ways the person makes sense of their participation, the ways they maintain some sense of themselves as decent, even as they do indecent things. But these justifications obscure the reality that choices existed, that resistance was possible even if costly, that others in similar circumstances refused to participate and survived. The claim of no choice is almost always false. There were choices. But the choices were hard, required courage, risked consequences. The person who descends into villainy is often the person who chose comfort or safety or advancement over resistance, who chose conformity over conscience, who took the easier path at each juncture and ended up somewhere they never intended to go. The descent also involves moral disengagement that happens gradually and becomes more complete over time. The person starts by convincing themselves that what they are doing is not really harmful, or that the harm is exaggerated, or that the victims deserve it. They progress to not thinking about the harm at all, to focusing on technical aspects of their role, to seeing people as numbers or logistics problems rather than as human beings. They reach a point where they can participate in extreme cruelty without experiencing it as such, where their moral faculties have been so successfully disengaged that they genuinely do not recognize what they are doing as wrong. This process is facilitated by what psychologists call moral numbing, the gradual desensitization to harm that occurs through repeated exposure. The first time a guard abuses a prisoner, they might feel guilt or discomfort. But after repeated instances, these feelings diminish. The behavior becomes routine, normalized, no longer triggers the emotional responses that would signal moral violation. The person becomes numb to the suffering they are causing, experiences it as normal rather than as aberrant. Context and situation matter enormously in moral descent. The same person who would never harm someone in ordinary circumstances can become cruel when placed in situations that provide authority, that normalize cruelty, that diffuse responsibility, that dehumanize victims, that create pressure to conform. This does not mean that individuals are not responsible for their actions. They are. But it means that villainy cannot be understood purely through individual psychology, must include analysis of situations and systems that make villainy more likely, that transform ordinary people into perpetrators. The descent into villainy is therefore not mysterious transformation of good people into monsters, but comprehensible process of gradual moral compromise, situational pressure, group dynamics, dehumanization, and moral disengagement. Understanding this process does not excuse it, but reveals how it operates, shows the mechanisms through which ordinary people can do extraordinary harm, explains how someone can travel from normal moral functioning to participation in atrocity without ever experiencing themselves as having become evil. This understanding is crucial for prevention. If villainy required inherent evil, required people to be born monsters, then there would be little we could do to prevent it beyond identifying and isolating the monsters. But if villainy is process, is something ordinary people can descend into under certain conditions, then we can work to change the conditions, to create situations that make villainy less likely, to interrupt the descent before it reaches its endpoint. The warning is that everyone is vulnerable. Not equally vulnerable. The person with severe trauma or personality disorder is at higher risk, but vulnerable nonetheless. The right combination of circumstances, pressures, justifications, and opportunities could set anyone on the path toward actions they currently find unthinkable. The descent is gradual enough, each step small enough, the justifications compelling enough, that most people would not recognize where they are heading until they have already arrived. This is why vigilance is essential, why we must question our own actions and justifications, why we must resist the first small steps, rather than waiting until the descent has progressed too far. Because by the time we recognize ourselves as having become villains, the psychological mechanisms that enabled the descent will prevent us from seeing clearly, will continue to justify our actions, will maintain the belief that we are different, that our circumstances were unique, that what we did was necessary, even if what others do is evil. The point of no return, when villainy becomes identity. There comes a point in the descent into villainy when actions that were once choices become identity, when behaviors that were initially responses to circumstances become fundamental to how the person understands who they are, when villainy transitions from something one does to something one is. This is the point of no return. Not because change becomes literally impossible, but because the psychological investment in being the villain becomes so complete that change would require dismantling the entire structure of self, would require admitting to oneself truths so devastating that the psyche cannot bear them. The transformation from doing evil to being evil happens through a process psychologists call commitment and consistency. Once a person has taken actions, especially actions that are public or that have significant consequences, they become psychologically committed to those actions, develop narratives that justify them, construct identities consistent with them. The person who commits a crime once might still see themselves as fundamentally good person who made a mistake, but the person who commits crimes repeatedly begins to see themselves as criminal, begins to embrace that identity, begins to organize their self-concept around it. This commitment intensifies with each action that reinforces the identity. The person who has harmed one person might still turn back, might feel remorse, might seek to make amends, but the person who has harmed many people faces a different psychological reality. To admit that what they did was wrong would mean admitting to being a monster, would mean accepting responsibility for immense suffering, would mean facing guilt so overwhelming that the psyche defends against it through continued denial through deeper commitment to the justifications that allowed the harm in the first place. This is the psychological trap of escalation. Each harmful action makes the next one easier, but also makes it harder to stop, creates investment in the narrative that justifies the actions, increases the psychological cost of admitting wrong. The person who has committed small wrongs can admit them without destroying their self-concept. But the person who has committed atrocities cannot admit them without admitting to being someone capable of atrocities. And this admission is so threatening to the ego that the defenses become more rigid, the justifications more elaborate, the commitment to the villainous identity more complete. The sunk cost fallacy operates in moral domains as well as economic ones. The person thinks, I've already done so much harm, sacrificed so much, committed so completely to this path. To turn back now would mean all of it was for nothing, would mean I destroyed myself and others for no purpose, would mean I became a monster for no reason. So they continue. Not because continuing is right, but because stopping would mean admitting that everything they did was wrong, and this admission is psychologically unbearable. This is how people who begin with understandable motivations end up committing increasingly extreme acts. The revolutionary who begins wanting justice becomes the terrorist who kills civilians. The person seeking revenge for genuine wrongs becomes the mass murderer who destroys innocence. At each stage, the person cannot turn back without admitting that the previous stage was wrong, and this admission becomes harder with each escalation until they are so deeply committed to the path that return seems impossible. Identity consolidation around villainy also provides psychological coherence that is hard to relinquish. The person who has embraced being the villain, who has made this their identity, knows who they are. They have clarity, have purpose, have a role that makes sense of their experience. To give this up would mean returning to uncertainty, to not knowing who they are, to having to rebuild identity from fragments. Even when the villainous identity is painful, even when it isolates them and makes genuine connection impossible, it provides the structure that keeps the psyche organized. The villainous identity also attracts certain kinds of relationships and communities that reinforce it. The person who has become a criminal finds community with other criminals who share their values, who validate their choices, who normalize what would be condemned in mainstream society. The person who has become cruel finds others who are cruel, who celebrate cruelty, who make it seem not just acceptable but admirable. These relationships create social investment in maintaining the identity, create fear that abandoning villainy would mean losing the only community one belongs to. Narrative construction becomes increasingly rigid and self-serving. The villain develops an elaborate story about why their actions are justified, why they had no choice, why they are actually the victim or the hero of their own story. This narrative is not simply deception of others, but self-deception, a way of maintaining coherent self-concept despite actions that would otherwise create unbearable cognitive dissonance. The narrative becomes immune to contrary evidence, interprets all feedback through its lens, dismisses challenges as coming from those who do not understand or who are complicit with the enemy. The loss of empathy becomes more complete as villainy becomes identity. Initially, the person may have had to suppress empathy to harm others, may have had to work to dehumanize victims, may have experienced guilt or discomfort that required active management. But over time, with repeated harmful actions, empathy itself atrophies. The person no longer feels the suffering of those they harm, no longer experiences their victims as fully human, no longer has the emotional responses that would create internal resistance to cruelty. This is not always the complete absence of empathy that characterizes psychopathy. The villain may still feel empathy for their in-group, for people they identify with, for those they care about. But empathy for victims, for those designated as enemy or other, becomes genuinely absent. The person can harm them without internal conflict, without guilt, without the emotional signals that would suggest moral violation. This selective empathy allows them to maintain some sense of humanity, some capacity for connection with those in their circle, while committing atrocities against those outside it. Grandiosity often develops as villainy becomes identity. The person who has committed extreme acts cannot maintain self-esteem through normal means, cannot see themselves as good person who made mistakes, so they develop alternative narratives of superiority, of being stronger than those bound by conventional morality, of being willing to do what others are too weak to do, of being special or chosen or beyond ordinary human constraints. This grandiosity is defensive, protecting against the alternative of seeing themselves as simply bad, as moral failures, as people who caused immense harm for no good reason. The villain may come to see themselves as tragic hero, as someone who had to become monster to achieve necessary goals, as someone who sacrificed their own goodness for the greater good, as someone misunderstood by those who lack the strength or vision to recognize that what appears to be evil is actually necessary. This self-conception allows them to maintain some sense of nobility even while committing ignoble acts, to see themselves as bearing a burden rather than simply causing harm, to frame their villainy as sacrifice rather than as choice. Remorse becomes psychologically impossible at this stage. To feel genuine remorse would require acknowledging the full reality of the harm caused, accepting responsibility without justification, facing the person one has become. But the person whose identity is consolidated around villainy cannot do this without psychological disintegration. The defenses that protect against this recognition, the justifications, the narratives, the dehumanization of victims, these are not optional protective measures that can be voluntarily released. They are structural elements of the psyche that maintain coherence, that prevent collapse into overwhelming guilt and self-hatred. This is why genuine transformation is so rare once villainy has become identity. The person would have to dismantle everything they have built, would have to face truths about themselves that their entire psychological structure is organized to avoid, would have to experience guilt and shame so extreme that they might not survive it psychologically. Most people cannot do this, cannot bear this level of self-confrontation, cannot endure the psychological death that would be required for rebirth as someone different. The point of no return is therefore not when the person has committed acts so extreme that forgiveness or redemption becomes impossible in some objective sense. It is when the person has invested so completely in being the villain, has organized their identity so thoroughly around it, has developed defenses so rigid against recognizing what they have become, that psychological change becomes nearly impossible. They are locked into the villainous identity not by external circumstances, but by internal psychological necessities, by the need to maintain coherence, by the impossibility of facing what they would have to face to change. This understanding reveals the importance of intervention early, before commitment becomes complete, before identity crystallizes around villainy, before the psychological investment makes change nearly impossible. The person who has taken first steps toward villainy can still turn back, can still see themselves differently, can still access the moral resources that would allow different choices, but the person who has fully embraced villainous identity, who has committed completely to the path, who has constructed elaborate defenses against seeing themselves clearly, this person is far harder to reach, far less likely to change, far more likely to continue escalating, because escalation is psychologically easier than the admission and transformation that turning back would require. The tragedy is that the point of no return is not always recognized by the person experiencing it. They may believe they could still turn back, could still change, could still be someone different if they chose. But the psychological reality is that the choice has already been made, not through single decision, but through accumulated commitments, through identity consolidated around actions that define them, through defenses that have become so automatic that they operate beneath awareness. The person is trapped not by external constraints, but by internal ones. Imprisoned not by circumstances, but by who they have become. Locked into villainy not by fate, but by the psychological processes through which actions become identity, and identity becomes destiny. Redemption or damnation. Can villains change? The question of whether villains can change whether redemption is possible for those who have committed terrible acts, is not simply philosophical, but intensely practical. It matters for how we structure justice systems, for how we respond to those who have harmed others, for whether we believe in the possibility of transformation or conclude that some people are permanently damaged, permanently dangerous, permanently beyond the reach of rehabilitation. The honest answer is complex and unsatisfying. Some can change under specific conditions, but many cannot or will not, and distinguishing between these groups is difficult and uncertain. Change requires elements that are rarely all present simultaneously. Genuine recognition of harm caused, willingness to face unbearable guilt and shame, removal from situations and relationships that reinforce villainous identity, encounter with the humanity of victims, development of empathy that was absent or suppressed, construction of new identity that acknowledges the past without being defined by it. Genuine recognition is the first requirement, and it is far rarer than superficial acknowledgement. The person must move beyond admitting facts to actually seeing and feeling the reality of what they did, experiencing their victims as fully human beings who suffered, accepting responsibility without minimization or justification. This is extraordinarily difficult because the entire structure of villainy is built on mechanisms that prevent this recognition. Dehumanization of victims, moral justifications for harm, narratives that frame cruel actions as necessary or justified. For recognition to occur, these defenses must be dismantled. But these defenses exist for a reason. They protect the person from overwhelming guilt and self-hatred that would result from fully seeing what they have done. Asking someone to dismantle these defenses is asking them to experience psychological pain that may feel unbearable, to face truths about themselves that threaten their entire sense of self, to accept that they are not who they believed themselves to be. This is why crisis often precedes change. The person must hit bottom, must experience consequences severe enough that maintaining the defenses becomes more painful than facing what the defenses are protecting them from. This might be loss of everything they value, might be imprisonment that forces reflection, might be betrayal by those they trusted, might be confrontation with their own mortality that makes continuing on the current path seem futile. But crisis alone is not sufficient. Plenty of people experience crisis and respond by doubling down on their previous patterns, by blaming others more intensely, by becoming more, rather than less, rigid in their defenses. Crisis creates opportunity for change but does not guarantee it. What matters is how the person responds to crisis, whether they use it for self-examination or for further justification of their victimhood and their right to harm others. Encounter with victims' humanity is particularly powerful when it occurs. The person who has dehumanized their victims, who has seen them as categories or threats rather than as people, may have this dehumanization shattered by direct confrontation with the actual human beings they harmed. Restorative justice programs that bring offenders face to face with victims, that require them to hear victims' stories and see victims' pain, can create breakthroughs that other interventions cannot achieve. But this encounter is dangerous, can be re-traumatizing for victims, can be performative rather than genuine if the offender is not actually ready to face what they have done. It requires careful facilitation, requires that the offender has already done significant work to develop capacity for empathy and remorse, requires that victims are willing to participate and are protected from further harm. When these conditions are met, when the encounter is genuine, the results can be transformative for both parties. Development of empathy is perhaps the most crucial element in transformation. The person who lacks empathy, who cannot feel others' pain, who experiences victims as objects rather than as beings like themselves, this person will continue to harm because there is no internal barrier against doing so. But empathy can develop, particularly if the person is removed from situations that required its suppression. If they form relationships with people who model empathy, if they engage in therapeutic work that helps them recognize and regulate their own emotions as foundation for recognizing others' emotions. This development is not quick. Neural pathways for empathy that were never fully developed or that atrophied through disuse cannot be reconstructed rapidly. It requires years of consistent work, requires relationships that are safe enough that the person can begin to be vulnerable, requires therapeutic approaches that work with the developmental deficits, and trauma that prevented empathy from developing naturally. But it is possible, particularly for those whose lack of empathy was learned rather than inherent, was result of trauma or conditioning rather than a fundamental neurological deficit. Construction of new identity is the final requirement. The person cannot simply stop being a villain without becoming something else. They need a new narrative, a new sense of who they are that includes acknowledgement of past actions but is not solely defined by them. This is delicate work. The person must accept full responsibility for what they did, must not minimize or excuse, must carry the weight of their actions. But they must also find a way to live with that weight, to construct a future that is not simply endless penance but contains possibility of contribution, of growth, of using their experience to help others avoid similar paths. Some who have transformed from villains become advocates, use their experience to warn others, work in intervention programs, dedicate themselves to causes that oppose what they once did. Former gang members work to keep youth out of gangs. Former extremists work to de-radicalize others. Former abusers work in programs for betterers. This work serves both others and themselves, provides purpose, allows them to make some restitution for harm they caused, even though nothing can undo that harm, gives them role that acknowledges their past while not being imprisoned by it. But transformation is not guaranteed. It's not even likely for most who have gone far down the path of villainy. The psychological investment in villainous identity is often too complete, the defenses too rigid, the capacity for change too damaged by the very processes that created the villain. The person who has fully embraced being a villain, who has organized their entire psyche around justifications for harm, who has lost or never developed empathy, who has no relationships that would support different ways of being, this person is unlikely to change regardless of intervention. This is uncomfortable truth that we must face. Not everyone can be redeemed. Not everyone will change. Some people, through combination of severe developmental trauma, personality disorder, complete moral disengagement, and decades of harmful behavior, have become so psychologically rigid, so defended against seeing themselves clearly, so invested in villainous identity, that transformation is functionally impossible. They may go through motions of change, may learn to say right things, may pretend remorse when it serves them. But genuine transformation, genuine development of empathy and conscience, genuine reconstruction of identity, this is beyond their capacity. Recognizing this is not giving up on people, but being realistic about human psychology, about the limits of change, about the fact that some damage is so profound and so early that it cannot be fully repaired. This recognition is important for protection of potential victims, for realistic assessment of risk, for not being naive about the possibility that someone who has committed extreme harm will suddenly become safe and trustworthy. But we must hold this realism alongside the recognition that some can change, that transformation is possible for those who have the capacity and the willingness, that giving up entirely on possibility of redemption is also wrong. The challenge is discernment, is developing the wisdom to recognize who might genuinely change versus who is simply performing change, who has capacity for transformation versus who is too damaged or too defended, who deserves another chance versus who remains genuinely dangerous. This discernment is imperfect. We will sometimes give chances to those who should not receive them. We will sometimes deny chances to those who might have genuinely transformed. But the attempt must be made. The assessment must be as careful and thorough as we can make it. The protection of potential victims must be balanced with recognition of human capacity for change, however limited that capacity might be. The ultimate answer to whether villains can change is therefore, some can, under specific conditions, with tremendous work over long periods of time, but many cannot or will not. and we must be realistic about both possibilities, neither giving up entirely on redemption nor being naive about its likelihood. Conclusion: understanding why people become villains reveals that villainy is not mysterious evil descending from nowhere, but comprehensible human process rooted in wounds and choices, shaped by trauma and circumstance, following patterns that can be identified and understood. The villain originates as wounded child, develops through resentment and revenge, descends through gradual moral compromises, consolidates around identity built on justifications and defenses, and reaches points where change becomes nearly impossible because the psychological investment is too complete. This understanding does not excuse villainy. Adults are responsible for their choices regardless of what shaped them, regardless of what was done to them, regardless of the psychological processes that made certain choices more likely. The person who commits atrocities bears responsibility for those atrocities, even if we can trace the path that led them there, even if we can identify the wounds and the mechanisms and the stages of descent. But understanding does something important. It reveals that villainy is not other, is not something that happens to fundamentally different kinds of people, is not safely distant from our own experience. The capacity exists in everyone. The wounds that create villains are common. The resentments that fuel revenge are familiar. The mechanisms of moral disengagement are available to all. The gradual descent is seductive, precisely because each step seems small, seems justified, seems like anyone would do the same. This recognition is uncomfortable because it means we cannot simply designate certain people as evil and ourselves as good, cannot draw clear lines that separate those capable of villainy from those who are not, cannot be certain that, under different circumstances, we would not have become what we now condemn. The villain is not alien but is comprehensible, is operating according to psychological processes we can recognize, is the person we might have become if our wounds had been different, if our circumstances had been other, if our choices had taken us down paths we avoided. The psychology of villainy also reveals the importance of intervention before descent becomes complete, before identity consolidates, before defenses become impermeable. The wounded child who might become a villain needs healing rather than further harm, needs relationships that show different possibilities, needs intervention that addresses trauma rather than punishing its symptoms. The person beginning to nurse resentment needs help processing anger differently, needs to see that revenge will not heal wounds, needs support in choosing different responses to legitimate grievances. The person taking first steps down the path of moral compromise needs to be confronted, needs to face consequences before investment becomes too complete, needs relationships that will not enable continued descent, needs situations that make it harder rather than easier to continue. These interventions are difficult, often fail, cannot save everyone, but they are more effective than waiting until the person has reached the point of no return, until villainy has become identity, until change requires psychological transformation that few can achieve. We must also examine the situations and systems that make villainy more likely, that create pressure toward moral compromise, that normalize cruelty, that dehumanize certain groups, that diffuse responsibility, that reward harmful behavior while punishing resistance. Individual responsibility matters, but so do contexts that make certain choices easier or harder, that create paths toward villainy or away from it, that shape what seems normal versus what seems unthinkable. The question of redemption remains complex. Some can change, some cannot. Discernment is difficult. We must hold space for possibility of transformation while being realistic about its rarity, must protect potential victims while not giving up entirely on human capacity for change, must demand accountability while recognizing that punishment alone rarely transforms, must balance justice with mercy, consequences with opportunity, protection of society with recognition of human complexity. Understanding why people become villains is not academic exercise but urgent practical necessity. It shapes how we respond to those who harm, how we structure justice and rehabilitation, how we intervene with those at risk, how it creates societies that make villainy less likely. It reveals that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, that we all contain potential for both, that circumstances and choices rather than inherent nature determine which potential we actualize. The villain is not the monster we would prefer to believe in, fundamentally different, safely other, easily identified and excluded. The villain is the person who walked a path we might have walked, who made choices we might have made, who became what we might have become under different circumstances. This recognition is not moral relativism or excuse for harm, but honest acknowledgement of human psychology, of how villainy actually develops, of our shared vulnerability to the processes that create it. The hope, if there is hope in this dark subject, is that understanding creates the possibility of prevention, of intervention, of change. Not guaranteed possibility, not easy possibility, but real possibility that if we understand the mechanisms we can work to interrupt them, can create conditions that make villainy less likely, can help those who might be saved before they descend too far. Some will become villains regardless, but some might not, and understanding why people become villains is how we identify those we might reach, those we might help, those whose descent we might prevent before it reaches its terrible conclusion. If this exploration of why people become villains has helped you understand how ordinary people commit extraordinary harm, how wounds can transform into weapons, how the path to villainy is gradual rather than sudden, then you have gained insight into one of the darkest aspects of human psychology. This understanding is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores the psychology of evil without simplifying it, that examines how people become villains without excusing their actions, that recognizes human complexity while maintaining moral clarity. Share this with those who need to understand that villainy is comprehensible, that it follows patterns, that it emerges from processes we can identify and potentially interrupt. Leave a comment sharing your reflections on how people become villains, on wounds you recognize, on dissent you have witnessed, on whether redemption is possible, on how we balance understanding with accountability. This community exists for those willing to face difficult truths about human nature, about our capacity for harm, about the thin line between victim and villain. Remember, understanding why people become villains is not about excusing them, but about recognizing the processes, about seeing how wounds become weapons, about knowing that the capacity exists in everyone and that vigilance is required. The villain is not safely other. The villain is what any of us might become if we nurse our wounds, embrace our resentments, take the first steps down the path and never turn back. Face your own capacity. Recognize the wounds that could transform into weapons. Choose healing over revenge. Break the cycle rather than perpetuating it. This is how we prevent villainy, not by denying our darkness, but by facing it consciously, by choosing different responses to our wounds, by refusing to become the monsters our pain might make us. Tai